Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I should say in starting, Ken has unbelievable amount of experience. He's a nice guy and he's incredibly responsive, which he should be with the pollution response group. So what we're covering today, if I can, it's moving. So this is the sequence we're going through today. I'll introduce the session with information about the incidence and character of asbestos contamination resulting from fire. I'll then hand over to Ken, who will talk about the response process and hopefully make some comparisons between what might happen in the urban and regional areas. He'll switch back to me, and then I'll talk about the guidance material that we've put out for managing such situations and how it's applied. Look at the lessons that have emerged over time, because we're constantly reviewing our processes and taking feedback from people and learning things and trying to make use of those. We'll work through a few case studies. I will speak to Yalu, which was a big bushfire probably 5 years or so ago, and then talk about some residential settings for asbestos fires. And then Ken will most recently talk about Seroja, maybe making some comparisons, because it was a hurricane asbestos related contamination rather than a fire, but it's good to have another major disaster where we still have a problem but of a slightly different nature. Just a slide or two on where we're going to and the resources that are available that might help you. So, fires in Australia, well, they're quite common. Australia and Western Australia in particular have a very dry, hot climate, and of course it would appear to be becoming even more so over time. So we're very prone to these sorts of conflagrations. Over time, there's usually a couple of major Australian bushfires each year, and of course, beginning of last year, much of the southeast of Australia was hit by very big bushfires, which destroyed many buildings, quite extreme. In Western Australia, being only part of Australia and a smaller population, we may only get a major every couple of years or so. However, in Perth and of course elsewhere in the state, there are thousands, in fact, probably many thousands of fires each year, usually covering structures of some sort. Most recently, there was the big fire at Wooroloo. And often these fires will be associated with buildings. In case of bushfires, there may be many hundreds. So it's a different and it's a more challenging issue from your normal asbestos contamination, partly for technical and partly for societal reasons. Any buildings built between 87 and maybe even before 90, sometimes we err on caution by making pre-90 buildings, are likely to have some asbestos in them, and if they're burnt, then you get asbestos contamination. Societally, it's very challenging because people may have lost their home, they may be in large numbers, particularly for major bushfires. Many agencies will get involved. In fact, I was involved with Seroja, and there were I didn't know there were so many government agencies that existed until I saw them deployed, but that makes coordination and transitioning between their various responsibilities quite difficult. And some in the case of local government may not have much experience, certainly with a major bushfire, they may not, affecting buildings. There can be enormous financial costs, particularly if there's no insurance or the government doesn't step in, which could break perhaps an uninsured owner. We've been looking at this for some while. In fact, Ken prompted me maybe nearly 10 years ago to get involved in this area. And so at that stage, we started trying to formalise how you manage such things. And as I mentioned, asbestos fires have special features. In comparison with normal contamination results from, say, physical breakage of asbestos cement most commonly, and we're mainly talking about asbestos cement sheeting because it's by far the most common material in bulk that might be encountered. With a fire, the asbestos sheet tends to open up, spoil or delaminate, because rather than the pressure or the force coming from outside, it comes from inside, because any moisture that's within the structure, when it's heated very suddenly, it can't get out easily and explodes open and fractures the asbestos sheeting. And then it might break it up quite extensively, quite different from your normal external force. And this can result in scattering, dispersion, particularly not only because of the fire effects, but any wind at the time, and certainly with a bushfire or even a house fire, they create their own wind vortex. And also the firefighting that might occur, people pouring water or other treatment agents onto it, or any rain might disperse that material. The top slide, of course, shows the delamination that occurs, a typical delamination. And as part of that process, because of that, those internal explosive forces, the material can become quite brittle and friable. The cement matrix is broken up, and that's an electron microscopy slide that we took of some material, and it shows the cement hardly holding, or fibers hardly holding the cement together. And so the material is likely to be brittle or even friable rather than well bonded. There is the possibility, if temperatures are high enough and the flame is on asbestos for long enough, the asbestos will denature. But in practice, this doesn't happen much and become less toxic because it explodes away from the flame. It doesn't normally get hot enough for long enough. So this is just a simple depiction from our guidelines, and also we have a brochure, and it depicts the sorts of contamination associated with a fire. So a single building, most of the asbestos will drop down into the footprint of the building. It will collapse or it will stay in place. But within the near perimeter of the building is a scatter zone. So the material that may have exploded, or depending on the weight, spread out around the perimeter of that building in roughly a circle, roughly a shape of the building, depending where the asbestos is. So that's another area of contamination.
I'd like to comment on that, if that's okay. So in a lot of the fires that we've attended with asbestos in it, we find, as John mentioned, that the fires create their own little weather pattern by drawing air in at the bottom and then having like a thermal buoyancy of the smoke plume going up. It'll actually take the spoiled asbestos and deploy it primarily downwind. And we found, and I'll show you some photos of this in my presentation, but we found asbestos up to about 100 metres downwind from some of the buildings that have caught fire and the asbestos is spoiled. So I can explain a bit.
Well, in fact, that graphic depicts that, because you have the arrow going up and the wind taking the material downwind, and it's settling out depending on its weight. And certainly you can, the further you go, the amount, only very light amounts will settle to the ground and they'll be more dispersed. Usually any fibre that's released, or fibre bundles, it's so light and the wind's so strong, it's dispersed and diluted and doesn't present a problem. So where is the risk? Based on what we've just seen, most of the asbestos will be in the footprint, and of greatest concern when that footprint is remediated. There's also the scattered material as well, and that can be a concern if people have access to the site, either before it's cleaned up, remediation doesn't occur. People may not go into the building itself, but they may not normally have a concern about walking around the perimeter where material may well be scattered and then be brittle, friable. Normally, as I said, the fibre itself is not an issue because the powerful weather patterns or wind associated with that destruction carries and disperses it massively. One should always be remember with these fires, there may be other toxic residues, such as from the burning of copper chrome arsenate treated timber, and these should also be taken into account. Okay. Yeah. So we have actually investigated this in some greater detail. Prina Otnest, our hygienist and also a toxicologist, went out and did some air sampling. This gives some of the results. So you can see at the top there's personal, so she was wearing a monitor while she potted around with that sort of asbestos, and that might be asbestos downpipe that was burnt, and so you can see the shape of it, but you can see that it's in a pretty poor condition. She also did some monitoring, that's the static on the left, and below that another static at increasing distances. The second measurement is taken as if there was someone standing nearby, and the third measurement, in fact, it's the other way around. I think the second measurement was at some distance, maybe near a perimeter fence, and the third was if someone was standing nearby. And you can see that for her, the level is higher, and she was wearing PPE, of course, and it was done on purpose, not really throwing things around, but pottering around. And then as you get further away, the level decreases. But those sort of levels are very low. The occupational action level tends to be about 0.01, which is twice as much as the one that she was exposed to, and their protection level is 0.1. So these are quite low levels, but we expect a greater degree of protection for for members of the public, particularly if they might be exposed to these materials for quite some while, but they won't be because they're going to be cleaned up. So here's having to resort. So I'll hand over to Ken for the more exciting part of the presentation. The only problem is it might be hard to stop him.
Speed with no accuracy. I'll try this. Negative. Thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present today. It came up at the MEMIG meeting a while ago, and we had a chat with Bree, so we're doing a joint between the two departments. I think that works well because we both have a role. So what I want to cover is just what we do with emergency response, and obviously I've got a small team in Perth. I've only got 5 officers, so we can't be all over the state. So what we're trying to do today is show you what we've learned over time and the procedures we used. And as the OHOs, you might be first on the ground and need to understand what to do if you're called out to a fire in your jurisdiction. So we don't need to cover much of that, but just to reiterate John's point that you have to respond quickly and expeditiously to manage not only the risk of asbestos, but the perceived risk. And often the perceived risk far outweighs the actual risk, but you need to address it. You can't, and I'll show you some video in a moment. Is that going to work, the video, you think? Maybe? Later. Yeah. Just to show you a media angle on how they belittled the advice from both health and our departments, and what you might end up having to deal with. So first thing I want to make clear is who's in charge. So if you get called out to an emergency, you need to understand how you fit into it. We, as either environment agency, health agencies or local government, are generally what we call a support agency. So you're providing support to a lead agency, which is generally DFES, the fire service or police. With fires and asbestos, it's generally fire brigade, but it could be, if it's like an arson or something like that, the police may be in charge. If it's a motor vehicle accident, may be police in charge. So when calls come to us, we try and make clear that Department of Health is the lead public health advisory agency, so we defer to DOH for the toxicological advice. We're the primary hazardous materials emergency response support, so we're the ones that get out and do the air monitoring for anything from chemical fires, explosions, chemical leaks, etc. And we do that initial emergency response for big asbestos jobs, not the general house fires, but we'll explain that shortly. So when you're at an incident, and this photograph is an asbestos fire in West Perth some years ago, where they have what they call an incident support group. So the lead agency like DECOs will say, right, we're having an ISG meeting. So if you understand that, you attend that, and they'll be seeking your advice as far as the public health risk and what should be done immediately and as part of the recovery. When there is, under the state laws, the Emergency Management Act, and the procedures, local governments generally are the recovery agency. So you end up being the last people standing after all the emergency services have gone. So we have categories, how we try and apportion risk to jobs. So we have what we call a Code 1 response, which is a low risk. So it might be a single house fire, or there's no schools or daycare centres, or if somebody's dumped a large load of asbestos, we call it a Code 1 low risk. Moderate risk is where we've got a fire or explosion in a large commercial industrial building. We've got asbestos, and we say ACM, you're aware this asbestos containing material impacts on surrounding industrial commercial properties, public recreation areas and things like that, but not residential or healthcare daycare. So an example we had some years ago, what was it? It was super cheap, and it blew asbestos all over the surrounding industrial area. And we will, I think a question has come up about a regional response, and we'll talk about that shortly. Our high risk ones, we got fire explosion, large numbers of buildings or large commercial industrial buildings, which have then impacted residential areas, healthcare facilities, or your whole towns impacted. I won't talk this in detail because we've got a lot to get through, but this is to try and explain the roles in these different risk statements. So in the Code 1 jobs, we don't have any role. Department of Health provides advice. The local government's Johnny on the spot. You're dealing with everything. And generally, you wouldn't have air monitoring or anything required, but it's open to John to comment on. But you may need to take samples to prove if it's asbestos, and we'll go through the asbestos identification process. Code 2s, we'll respond if DECO's asked us to, but we're stuck with probably about 100 to 200 kilometres radius from Perth, unless it's a major incident like Seroja, where we had to deploy by RAAF aircraft. And Code 3, the big ones, high risk, we do the same, and we have on-scene attendance, etc. So this is probably the most important bit, is to try and put some logic to what you might be required to do when you attend. So it's really got about six stages you look at. So the first thing, obviously, after you've looked after your safety, and we'll go into that to a degree, but you need to identify, is it asbestos or not? So often the fire service or police will say, look, is that asbestos? And we'll run through a bit of that shortly, and then work out where has it gone. As John said, the impact zone can be downwind from the fire or the explosion or whatever, and you need to be able to get the right PPE on, work within the incident command system, generally take a DFIS person with you to make sure you're safe, and go and have a look around those areas and say, this is the area of impact. Then you need to secure that area, risk assess it, and then stabilise it, and then organise cleanup. We'll go through those stages. First on PPE, so you should be all aware of this. So if you're going into what we call the hot zone, so the impact area, really you just have a disposable suit, boot covers, gloves, P2, that you can not take any contamination outside that area or back into your vehicle or back into your office. We do have a video available on how to use that. It's in the resources listed at the end of the presentation. Let's show that video. So the first step, field identification. So we go through a process of visual assessment. As John said, if you look at how old the building is and what the roof looked like before it was burnt, so often we'll whip out NAIR map and have a quick look. And then you do your assessment of the profile. Is it the Super 6 profile, or is it the finer profile, etc. Magnification is good, so we reckon you get up to about 85% accuracy if you get a little magnifier and look at the presence of fibres. Scratch it, we can do a burn test. We use a device called a microphaser, which gets us up to about 97% accuracy, and then you're 100% with your laboratory analysis. So there's your visual assessment. There's the fire in West Perth, and if you're reasonably experienced, you look at that and go, look, that's an asbestos roof. 90-something% sure. As John said, you can see how it's spalled, it's all exploded. The steam internally has ruptured the material. You can see the fibres present. So you probably will see a lot of this is taken out of the Department of Health's guidance, so I won't go through it in great detail. Little burn test, we've got a procedure for that. If anyone wants to have a procedure, we're happy to share with it, including not burning your fingers. Then we use this thing called a microphaser. We bought that not that long ago. It's a $50,000 bit of kit. We didn't buy it many years ago. It wasn't accurate enough, but we've used it now and believe it's accurate, and it's been testing done to show it is. However, it's not an approved method for definitive analysis, so it's a field screening tool. The only definitive way is to actually get it analysed in a NATA approved lab, but this helps us do some decision making on the field. Delineating downward areas, so this is just the map that when we're in Kalbarri trying to work out, driving slowly around the roads and jumping out, having a look, and these are the impacted areas. So it's as simple as that. You don't have to have anything particularly complex. We're starting to use a tool called Arcgis Survey123, which is a really good online tool. When we found bits on the road, we just got some blue road chalk paint and then marked it out so we could then delineate the area to keep people out. This is we've got Mark Lewis from WorkSafe, 2 EHOs, one of my staff, and we've just done preparing to go and have a look at an impact zone. That's what your spalled asbestos might look like on the ground. This is a panel shop fire in Fremantle a few years ago. It had an asbestos roof, and you can see the angle we're taking the shot from. We're actually on the 3rd floor of a block of units, and we've got spalled asbestos on these units. So it went a lot further than we thought with the thermal buoyancy, and it was raining that night, as John said, so we had stuff going down drains. That's the impact zone map from the fire in West Perth with that roof I just showed you. So to find the area, then you need to secure it. So you ask for the roads to be shut down so you don't have vehicles driving through there, including footpaths and bike paths. So we've had roads shut down and then cyclists got driving straight through contaminated areas in the past. First thing is to get it wet down, get your fire service to apply water to keep it wet, and try and do it in such a way you don't have runoff into drains. If you are going to have runoff, you need to block the drains to stop the spread. Securing the area. So these are signs we've had put up at Wooroloo, just to advise people there's asbestos hazard up ahead. That's at our request. DFIS was keeping that roof wet down until we could work out what to do with encapsulation or cleanup. This is a shot from that fire at the panel shop where it was running down drains, so we just used some oil filter pads to block the drains to stop the fibres and spalled asbestos going down the drains. Fourth is then you do your risk assessment and work out what do you really need to do. So recently Bayswater had a fire with an asbestos roof that kind of exploded and went over into adjoining residential properties, and you have to work out, do you really need to evacuate people or can they shelter in place? When we've had one particular job where it was commercial impact outside the commercial buildings, we looked at, we talked with the health department, can they stay in the building and keep working? And the answer was yes, but they had to turn the air conditioners off, and if they went outside they had to wear P2 respirators, and they couldn't walk in areas where we found contamination. Then you need to work how you're going to decontaminate people when they come out of the area, including vehicles, etc. Next stage is temporary stabilisation while you work out your cleanup. So this is what we did up at Wooroloo. So we worked with the 2 local governments, Swan and Mundaring, and Department of Health and WorkSafe to get a system that would be compliant with the relevant legislation, but really practical and fast. So we prioritised what needed to be done first, and then you get a glue solution, as you all know, the PVA glue. But we've been using Bondcrete, which is a type of PVA which is more resistant to breakdown by UV light, and we'll also make sure there's blue paint in there. So anything that's got blue paint on it, people know it's asbestos. Right, and again, we have to be pragmatic. You might have to work out all sorts of different solutions on how you're going to achieve this, which we've had to do. And we can talk about recontamination of roads, which happened in Kalbarri a bit later. This is just one where it was using a backpack spray because it wasn't suitable to get a vehicle in there. So clean up. This again, you need to use your common sense. So one of the jobs we do, we've got fire brigade officers in Tyveks and boot covers to just walk a metre apart, arm distance apart in a grid pattern across an area of car park and pick up every little bit of ACM. Obviously you have to have the gloves on and hazardous materials bags, plastic bags or double bag rubbish bags to put it in. Done wet street sweeping, but make sure that the street sweeper's got high efficiency particulate filters on it. We've done things like wash roofs down, but before we did that, we've gotten to put like swimming pool socks on the downpipe so that you're not just flushing it all down onto driveways or garden beds. Vegetation topsoil. So some of you have no doubt done this with people washing down or high pressure cleaning roofs where you've had to take all the vegetation off. Foodstuffs, you know about as EHOs. We talked about drains and things before. The other thing to consider is air conditioning swimming pool pumps. Filters may need to be cleaned or replaced. So the ones I've done, we just recommend replace them, bagging them and replacing rather than trying to hose them out and define that they're clean. That's just a job where we had DFES doing a hose down to wash all the asbestos material into one area so it can be picked up. Obviously, you've got to use low pressure sprays. That looks like a bit of a high pressure spray, but ideally you'd like it low pressure so you're not shooting it around or breaking up the asbestos into more than it already is. Some of the recovery actions you might have to take. So there may be demand for or advice from the health department about air monitoring, which John's already spoken about. There may be surface sampling, like doing sticky tape testing of things on surfaces, providing advice. John mentioned insurance companies. We won't go into that in detail, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone afterwards. You may need to serve notices under the Public Health Act for clean-up or management or health risks. Decontamination, you don't want anything going off-site, taking contamination away. The waste disposal and transport is really important, but you think that through, that you don't want a truck carrying the asbestos material through a residential area with no covers on it, not wet down, etc. And then you need to work out how you're going to validate the clean-up. I won't go into detail, but you can read through that. But basically, just think through, if you're going to go into a contaminated area, you've got PPE, what are you going to do with it? You can't just put it in the back of your car or dump it on the side of the road, just have a plan. Including your vehicles, if you've driven in there, how you're going to wash the vehicles down. That's just a shot from Signage, where each vehicle we use, because we're sharing vehicles, we decontaminate them and then wash them out, even though we're using boot covers, just to make people really comfortable that the decontaminations were happening. Right. So just summarising, so you need to identify the ACM, delineate the impact zone, secure that area, get it shut down, stop vehicles, people going through. Do that risk assessment. Do you need to do air monitoring? Do you need to clean up? Do you need to move people out or protect them in some way? Stabilise it whilst you're waiting for clean up, and then finally clean up validation. And there's resources that you can have a look at later. Right, back to you, John, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ken. You certainly covered a lot of ground, and there are a lot of decisions that need to be made along the way. Fortunately, as we'll indicate soon, there is guidance material that takes you on that journey, so to speak, and much of the work may well be done by specialists in this area, may be guided by yourselves and the guidance material. So our role is partly or mainly under the health asbestos regulations. Local government would normally take the lead, but we've developed guidance material and we're always there to help. We do deploy, we do respond as necessary. The Department of Health, or in fact our directorate, is also a key advisor to the Department of Water and Environment, etc., under the Contaminated Sites Act 2003, and that's a particular aspect of asbestos fire contamination, the contamination of the surrounding area. We have developed guidelines on asbestos in soil, and Bree mentioned that parts of them have been adopted nationally, and deriving from that guidance that originally went out in 2009, and with input from Ken in particular from work, we developed in 2014 a guidance note on the management of asbestos, fire damaged asbestos. And within that, we tried to, consistent with our other guidelines, ensure that asbestos, any asbestos contamination in soil is less than that very low amount. And from our sampling, at any distance from the fire, you don't get any settlement, you don't get any contamination normally. But as you get closer, you do. So that's what we aim at, and also for a fibre level in air less than 0.01%, 1 fibre per mil for an extended period of time. And that's why these sorts of measurements, contamination measurements, can be very handy. I should say that those levels are based on Department of Health trying to achieve less than 1 in 1 million possibility of an asbestos disease mesothelioma. And it's probably worth mentioning in these COVID times that the likelihood of getting a blood clot from, say, taking AstraZeneca and dying from it are about 1 in a million. So these are pretty remote things that might happen. And so, so that's what I'm doing. Lucky you're here, and Ken as well, of course. So the guidance note, and this is 2014, and so it is getting a little bit old, and in fact it does need to be revisited, but it stood the test of time pretty well. It covers those elements that Ken mentioned: the incident, the immediate actions, the assessment, the remediation, validation, and also includes lessons learned both from bushfire situations and urban fires. It integrates or tries to bring together all the various environmental legislations and roles played by the different players. It draws upon research, the work of consultants and DOH experience, and to a certain extent from other agencies. It has various usability tools such as flow diagrams, checklists, and I'll take you through some of these briefly. It also includes a public brochure, which can be, and I'll just hold it up, probably can't read it from there, and it's normally in colour and glossy, better and better. So this can actually be given to members of the public or people who are concerned about fire to re-inform and reassure them. And as I say, it's been extensively used since that time. I think it stood the test of time. Okay. I'll work it out.
Not that much, don't press that one. That's the wings
I've lost everyone.
That's the wings fall off on that.
So this is the flow diagram, and again, it reiterates what Ken was speaking about. And unfortunately, I'm not very good at IT, so that's why the fire event is off to the left, and things are a little bit skewed. But what it does include is also, as well as the steps, the various players that might be involved at different stages. And as I say, local government may not have to do too much depending on the nature of the beast, the size of the fire and so forth, but they tend to have a greater role towards the end of the sequence, the recovery rather than the immediate response process. So in the guidelines, it starts with that flow diagram and background information, and then gets into the detail of the various steps. The people have responsibilities and how they discharge them, the timeframes that might reasonably apply. Now but at the end we have this checklist, which is a summary of all the text, because sometimes it takes a while to wade through the text. So this is a checklist which correlates with the main body of the guidance, and it's got page numbers and so forth, and it puts it in dot point. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it indicates the various players or people or agencies that are most likely involved at the different stages. So that's the fire event, then the initial management measures, then the assessment stage, and how you source asbestos professionals to do some of the important work. It may be, if the West Australian government is involved, they will facilitate all this with input from the local government, If it's a smaller type issue, it may be that, say, a single residential fire in an urban area, then it may be that the local government orchestrates most of this. But again, with assistance from professionals and with support from the Department of Health. And then in more detail, the remediation, and again, the asbestos professionals you might use, and that probably and includes validation. So what have we learned? And some of these, over time, some of these lessons are incorporated into that guidance, but I think there's been a lot of crises since that time, so we need to revisit the things that we've learned since then. So managing people, neighbours, people in the vicinity who are concerned about whether they're at risk or not, and the contamination. So and the response to that is extensive consultation and some of that air monitoring that Ken and I have been talking about. In most cases, you get readings below the limit of detection. In fact, maybe 99% of the cases. Very rarely would you get it above that. But that provides concrete reassurance for people that they're not at risk. So often it's done for that purpose rather than to estimate the risk, because often it's quite really low. There's a problem in the cleanup of cross-contamination, because when, say, a house or an area around a house is cleaned up, it's done in a sequence or by sectors, and if one's not careful, then one can or mature from the dirty area might migrate into the clean area. So often there needs to be close supervision of contractors, and then validation. In other words, after they clean up, then there's either a visual assessment of the cleaned area or maybe sampling.
Am I able to just jump in for a second?
Yeah,
that's right. So just with that cross-contamination, if and when you get called out by an emergency service, you may need to look at what they've been doing. So, for example, we've had situations where the fire brigade people have been in the contaminated area, then jumped out and got into their trucks and driven off, or police officers have been into a lead contaminated area. So you need to, as EHOs, stand up and say, excuse me, I'm concerned about, you could have taken bits of asbestos back into your vehicles. Can you clean them down or decontaminate or give advice to that? And generally they'll take that fairly well. They go, oops, we didn't think of that, right? Everyone stop, who's been in, who's been out. So I think that's a really valuable service you can provide as environmental health professionals.
And another example of that, up in Seroja, up in Kalbarri, a lot of asbestos contamination went in someone's backyard, and we thought it may be localised there, but then aerial shots showed that cars regularly went in that area and out, so they were likely to carry material out. So there can be things that have happened before you're there, or even after you're there, that can cause that contamination to move around and contaminate clean areas. Another issue is uneven or non-uniform cleanup of areas. Again, up in Kalbarri, quite often there were removers doing cleanups, different removers, different areas, maybe using different procedures, not necessarily the optimal procedure and not necessarily standardised. So our guidance attempts to standardise, and if we have a role or there's an agency guiding everything, then often they will attempt to standardise and coordinate so that things are done to a consistent, acceptable standard. And especially in remote areas, if there is a fire and there's lots of contaminated material, there can be difficulty in finding a place to dispose of it. And certainly down in Margaret River, and we're going back a fair while, and the government facilitated the disposal of that material by being more flexible as to how it was managed and where it might end up going. And an evergreen or ongoing problem is the transition from response to recovery, because we have many agencies at the front end, and some of the roles of agencies interplay. They have different responsibilities. And over time, that responsibility transfers to the local government or to others. And how that happens, when it happens, how any information that's gleaned along the way is passed on are all quite critical. We've tried to capture that in the guidance, but I think that is an area we really do need to revisit, particularly since we've got Ken next to us and he's a font of knowledge and very willing to share it.
For a fee. No, you other mouse button.
Oh, so we've moved on. So that was some lessons from larger type fires. Some lessons in regard to, say, a residential or a more limited fire. The importance of using proper professionals for often the assessment, but certainly the clean-up process. We strongly recommend an unrestricted licence for that clean-up because the compromised nature of the material and the fact that it may spread around, and it would be, most of it would be beyond the experience normally of someone with a restricted asbestos removal licence. So, and I think WorkSafe probably also has that requirement, but we probably need to check again with their requirements in that regard. But certainly that's the way to go. Also, the responsibility for cleanup. If the material is migrated into adjacent properties, who is responsible? Is it the original? Is it the owner of the source property? And you have to deal with insurers in that regard too. And we're revising our health asbestos regulations. We're trying to be a bit more specific as to how that's managed. And our belief is that the insurer or the owner of the source property should take the responsibility for the cleanup. Also striking the balance in working with WorkSafe, especially on commercial properties. Our regs actually allow us to apply them in any situations, but normally we would defer to WorkSafe in workplace type situations because they've got the greater powers and responsibilities, but we would work with them. We also useful, we think, and this partly comes from David Cook in the city of Swan, some additional things that he thought would be useful, though he was talking more about a regional fire, but it would apply perhaps in whatever situation. The usefulness of a standardised written notice under the health asbestos regs, and for one to have a kit of materials ready for a fire eventuality if it occurs. It's hard to anticipate a major bushfire, but certainly house fires occur all the time, and it would be good to have a kit. So we've had that sort of feedback, and it may be in our revision of the guidelines we try to indicate what would be worthwhile in that regard.
See if I can answer it.
Oh, it's the other one. Let's back this one. Okay, so I'm going to work through an example that I have some familiarity with, even though Wooroloo is much more recent. But I think this is a good example. So back in 2016, and often these things happen early in the year, not surprisingly, a major bushfire swept through Yaaloop, Waroona and the Harvey area, but much of the damage was done in the township of Yaaloop. So 160 or so houses or buildings were destroyed or severely damaged in those areas. And many, given the age of certainly Yaaloop's a heritage type town, given the age of many of the buildings, most of them, or a great number of them, contained asbestos. And of course, the fire and emergency personnel deployed in the first instance and quarantined and evacuated and quarantined. In fact, I think the evacuation occurred very early in the piece because it was very hard to defend these properties. Thank you. If I act helpless enough, Bree does anything, or within minutes for me. So this is a DFAS graphic of the damage, and the central part, straddling the railway line, is the main part of the town of Yaaloop, though it spreads north and south. And all the red marks tend to be the properties or buildings that were most heavily damaged or utterly destroyed. And you can see there is a concentration of them there, but there's buildings all over the place that were also damaged. And I think when DFAS did that and that quick survey, they also noted which ones they believe are most likely to have asbestos contamination. Able assistant, thank you. So it ended up that the government stepped in very quickly and took the main coordinating role of it and the dealing and financing the cleanup. And they were quite quick to get a cleanup specialist, and we'll use some of their slides in this presentation, ERC, who'd done similar type work in other bushfire affected areas and where buildings were destroyed. And so this organisation, ERC, was employed to take actions immediately, assess contamination, and then scope out, supervise, validate, and document the cleanup process. In all that, it's DOH guidelines rather than, oh no, it is a guidance, no, don't forget. It was used to help direct what happened, and Department of Health, our area, constantly interact with local government, other players, and with the consultant to progress the cleanup. This included allowing or supporting Anzac Day ceremonies, as you can see down there, a rainy day occurring a month or so, maybe 2 months, because it occurred in January, but to allow them to occur while before the cleanup had occurred, but cleanup had been done in the relevant areas. We also published some guidance material to help the reoccupation process, because not surprisingly, people were damn keen to get in. And even when it was a quarantine area, and I was down there at that time, people somehow got in there and were starting to rebuild. So that's something you need to be aware of. They'll find ways of getting in, not only to get personal possessions back, but maybe try to clean the place themselves and start rebuilding. So we, as I say, we went down there, we did some of the work ourselves, not the really dangerous work, more to do with, and I'll go into more details about that later. Next, please. So these are ERC slides, and this is the immediate response. So we're just going through a process similar to what Ken has gone through. It doesn't hurt to reinforce it from a different perspective, but it shows that what he said is right on this occasion.
Occasionally, every now and again.
Yes, we are consistent.
We play the odds.
So they started doing the site inspections, gathering data. And so the local government didn't have to do much in this regard because the government employed this specialist to carry it all forward, but the local government still had a role. They had to be consulted. They had to be in agreement with what was happening, and they had a crucial part in communicating with the community as to what was happening and reassuring. So ambient air monitoring occurred, the stabilization as mentioned by Ken, and a range of other tasks. And this is what they tended to do first up. So you can, there's another picture of the town, and those yellow marks, and I think there's 70 or so of them, indicate where the air monitoring was done. They really blitzed it, but if your state government's paying for it, well, this sort of thing can happen. And they were not only looking for asbestos fibre, but levels of dust and things like the copper chrome arsenate, which might be associated with that treated timber. And to the best of my knowledge, they very rarely got a reading above the level of detection. But that was fed back to the community. And the stabilisation, as we mentioned, I think the concrete idea rather than PVC is a very good idea, particularly if there may be rain along the way, not necessarily in the middle of summer, but even so, a PVC treatment may degrade within a certain period of time. So signage, demarcation. Next, please. Then the scoping stage, where on an individual property basis, ERC with their demolition crew and asbestos removers would go from site to site, determining what needed to be done, but also involving the owner, because they wanted to remove the contamination, but anything that was worth keeping, like shrubbery and so forth, which may not be associated with an asbestos contaminated property, they needed to retain. So it was very tailored to specific situations and the owner's requirements or preferences. And for each of them, the cost of the work would be worked out. And so that was done in a very systematic way, but it took many months to go through. And as you can see at the bottom, they were looking at doing 4 to 8 of these areas per day, and 4 months, but that was just one part of it. So this is one of their rough diagrams of the various aspects associated with a particular site cleanup, the sequence they were looking at doing in the 1, 2, 3, 4, various features of the area, things that they wish to retain if possible. So it was all done quite meticulously and in a sequence. Next, please. So at the top, you can see one of the, probably a series of houses that were destroyed and after the event, and then what resulted later on. And you can see that everything's removed. In fact, they've dug down, it would appear, a reasonable amount to remove the soil, because it might be contaminated with fine material. It's not always necessary to excavate, particularly if any contamination is localised. But again, I think they did more rather than less, partly for reassurance purposes, and the budget was unlimited. Sorry, did I say nothing wrong?
31 million.
Local government should take a very cautionary and frugal approach. So with the validation, again, you can see that they did everything. The air monitoring, and this was not just, air monitoring was ongoing. Initially, during the remediation, and afterwards, to show that there was no asbestos in the air afterwards. And then teams of people would be sent across the remediated area to emu pick or rake the soil, if it was soft, to see if there was any asbestos in it. ERC, so that was done by the contractor. ERC, their consultants, would do an inspection. Soil samples were taken and sent off to a lab, again, to see if there was any asbestos or other contaminants present. So it's almost like a military operation. And I think they found very useful, given the really thorough process that had already occurred. So as a separate exercise, ERC mainly focused their work on those really damaged or destroyed properties where there was a lot of asbestos contamination. So they asked us, or the Department of Health, in conjunction with local government, to look at adjacent properties that might have some contamination. So myself with Dave Peckett, some of you may know Dave Peckett, he's a lot taller there than usually. In fact, he's there checking the roof to see if there's any asbestos fragments. But we were deployed to look at 150 or so other properties that weren't destroyed but may have been contaminated by that asbestos dispersal. And we made a short list based on the proximity of those properties to properties with asbestos in them, and also wind direction and reasonable expectation of asbestos migration. So we ended up with 55 suspect properties, and we went there in March 2016 and found that 16 of them had low localised levels of asbestos contamination up to considerable impact. So we in fact developed a rating system so that we could provide information as to the level of risk and the priority that might be given to them in the cleanup. And we also, for those that had low contamination, the owners wanted to go back and reoccupy possibly, we gave them some guidance in that regard, because we couldn't necessarily keep them out indefinitely. I should say that because of the power of that particular bushfire, the fine material, the little flakes that Ken and I were talking about in the plume, which normally might settle down, maybe up to 100 metres or so downwind of the fires, was not there. The wind was just so extreme that only the heaviest material, relatively close to the properties, stayed there. So that made clean up a bit easier. I can go on. So other features of that particular situation, as I've indicated, the government threw a lot at it. From our perspective, they went well beyond probably what was necessary in our guidelines. Our guidelines tend to be quite practical but protective, but because the government was involved, and there was also a tremendous need to reassure the public and show them the government was doing the right thing, they did an extremely good job. Not only did they cover the private residences, they covered the commercial, the public, the schools, heritage areas, the works pretty well, though on a priority basis. And even when they encountered other asbestos contamination that pre-existed in the site, they cleaned that up as well. So it's a squeaky clean town that's still in the process of being rebuilt. And I can't overemphasize the importance of managing and reassuring the members of the public in regard to reoccupation and access to their destroyed properties or properties that still remain intact. So that was Yalu and a major bushfire. I've borrowed from the city of Rockingham a few of their slides and some of their thinking, even though I've been to a number of residential fires, probably 4 or 5. I don't have the same level of information and photographs on them, and I thought it would be good to get a local government perspective on this. So the City of Rockingham, I think, did a presentation not too long ago on this issue, and as I say, I borrowed some of their slides or text. They've been good enough to share that with us. And they may have quite a few house fires during the course of the year, and to the extent that some of them or a number of them have asbestos, they've actually got a procedure set out. So their health services areas, if they get that sort of thing, and it may be this applies to other fires, not just asbestos fire, they get their building department involved. They check on the weather conditions at the time of the fire to get a sense as prevailing wind direction, though of course in a fire, then sometimes that can defy or complicate the prevailing wind direction. And check for information on their files in regard to the nature of the building and whether there is any asbestos or other possibly toxic or materials of concern. And they make use of a mapping system to look at the area and to estimate where contamination might occur. And then they get in contact with the owners, presumably to arrange inspection and to reassure them that they're on the job. And normally they would send out a couple of officers. So when they go out, they have a kit, a box of paraphernalia that is specific to the purpose, or maybe several boxes. Some of it includes the personal protection for themselves, contamination management material that might be flags or maybe something that could, or signs to help delineate the area and warn, recording equipment, in other words, stuff to capture data with, and maybe to take samples to confirm that there's asbestos there. I believe they normally do a visual sweep, not only of the source site, but adjacent and downwind areas, and also focus on any areas where water may have run off, such as during the firefighting process, because quite often that drainage canal will have fragments of material that run down and maybe towards a drain, and capture all that information. Something that they do, which is novel to me, but quite a good idea, particularly access is difficult in some areas, is to use a drone to take some photograph. And as I say, take samples if necessary. And to be sure, you really do have to take a sample and send it off the lab to know for certain. And to use some of that material to delineate where and maybe secure the site where there may be contamination. And chances are, even if there's not asbestos there, the site should be secured. But if there is asbestos there, that air of contamination may spread beyond. And they have, of course, work with the owners and liaise with the locals, because invariably if there's asbestos fire, particularly if it's an asbestos roof, because the asbestos roof is raised up, it's normally in a poor condition. If it's near the coast, it's even in a poorer condition still, and it may well have a lot of moisture in it or some moisture in it, and that can really easily spread into adjacent areas. If it happened to be an asbestos fence, it's more likely to be localised, the contamination. One place. So this is one of the sites that they went to, and in the centre with the red box is the building that was burnt down, and you can see a picture of it bottom left. But you can see there was an asbestos fence there. There was probably other asbestos material which migrated into other properties, but many of the surrounding properties have some contamination associated, probably quite low level, but still needing to be identified and managed and not disturbed until that happens. Next, please. So this is a separate fire, and I assume it's a shed. It's either that or it's a pretty small house. There's a proper house next door. But anyway, it's an asbestos roof, and you can see that it's taken a bit of a beating there. The next slide will show how the contamination migrated. So the wind was coming from that particular direction, west-southwest. And the red area is more or less the building footprint and the immediate scatter zone. Migrating beyond that, I assume the orange area, more debris and less of it, and across the road into a park area. And I think on the left-hand side there, what appears to be a children's playground, material has migrated across there. It must have also landed on the road, and the road would normally be a high priority cleaning up, even before the other areas, particularly if it was a major thoroughfare, because you have to open it up and allow traffic through. And so it may well be that DEFIS and pollution response, if they were there, would have done that cleaning because it's high priority and could transfer elsewhere. So the Rockingham, the role that they have is, as they see it, they do the site inspections, they take samples as necessary, they issue an asbestos notice in regard to the cleanup. This would be on the owner of the source site, but it may be, and preferably requiring them to clean up adjacent areas, but if there's some reluctance there, it would have to be through negotiation, hopefully, to do those other areas. They refer to an unrestricted license holder list, and I think maybe there's 10 or 15, maybe 10 or so of unrestricted license holders in the Perth area or in Western Australia, and they would ask the owner to get one of those to be involved in the cleanup. They would notify, or maybe have, well, they would certainly let the affected properties know what's happening and also the level of risk that they might be subject to. Secure the site if necessary. If it's city land, then they have much more responsibility in regard to the cleanup. And I think the last reference is that if under a notice a cleanup doesn't occur in a certain period of time, maybe they extend the period for that to happen. Next, please. So with the contractor, it should be an unrestricted license holder. That person, in conjunction with an independent hygienist, would work assessing the site and determining what needs to be done, and developing a plan of action, scope of works and so forth for the removal and cleanup. We would not always expect an occupational hygienist to be involved from our perspective, but it's a good thing. Normally, someone with an unrestricted licence would have the expertise, but it does provide an independent person to monitor what's being done and provide additional expertise on the work. With the clearance, what would normally be expected would be copies of all analytical results after the cleanup, showing that the site has no asbestos contamination, and air monitoring to be at levels below the limit of detection, and an occupational hygienist can capture that. And also clearance certificates, they need to certify that it's cleaned, and disposal receipts from the unrestricted licence holder for what went to the tip, the suitable asbestos disposal tip. Next. So they did a SWOT analysis of their experience and the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities and so forth, and we'll use that in our revision of our guidelines. But some of the key things that they identified as issues was if an insurer is unwilling or there is no insurer to help do the work, because it can be extremely expensive. If there is no insurer, the owner may not be able to bear the cost. And so what you do in those situations, normally it's not an urgent matter to clean up a site. If it's stabilised, could stay that way for a while, but eventually it needs to be done. We would normally work with the local government and the owner to come up with a reasonable compromise that was still protected but maybe more cheap. They have the issue of determining friability of the asbestos contamination. Our belief is you treat it all as friable because it's been compromised, the matrix being compromised, so you treat it as all as friable and high risk and therefore an unrestricted licence holder. And they do, it is possible with WorkSafe's agreement and our agreement under close supervision, maybe for someone with a restricted licence, particularly say in a country area where unrestricted licenses are hard to come by, but that would be through negotiation. WorkSafe, important to engage. I think they're increasingly involved in these sorts of things, and also for the importance of Navy education and compliance. I think that's the last one. Over to you.
Okay. I'll grab the mouse and make it easy for you to breathe.
You can manage it yourself.
Oh, it's multitasking. And having said that, I'll probably rank it. Okay, just want to run quickly through some of the unique things we dealt with tropical cyclone Saroja. So that was hit on the night of the 11th, 12th of April this year. So it came across, I think it was category 3, and then went. So it hit basically around Kalbarri and then went through and dropped down. So it hit a number of areas down here, but Kalbarri and Northampton got the main attention. But I know there was impacts further down. I won't go through all that. But something we don't really know about that they reckon at least 229 people killed in Indonesia before it even made it to Australia. And that's something that I didn't know at the time. A lot of the houses in Kalbarri and Northampton had asbestos in them. On the Wednesday afternoon, I got a request from DFES. They wanted a pollution response officer up there to assist with potential asbestos issues. We hadn't heard anything between the Monday and the Wednesday, so we thought we really didn't have much to do up there. So we had to send an officer up on a Hercules the next morning, Thursday morning. He took a bunch of equipment with him. But then on the Thursday night, things changed a little bit. So I don't know, Bree, you able to run that video or?
Put it at the end.
It's at the end, okay, I'll show it at the end. So basically on the Thursday night, there was Jeff Parry, 7. Nightly News ran a story really sort of belittling the advice that's been given by the Department of Health and our department about the risk. And some of it was valid, that there was stuff on the roads we didn't even know about. So but it escalated the whole situation. So DFES contacted me on the Friday, said, look, we need support. So advised them straight away, like shut all the roads down that have got asbestos on them, get every water truck you can find, mine sites, main roads, local government, wherever, get the roads wet and keep them going on a rotation, block the drains, then obtain some blue paint, Bondcrete, PVA, get as much as you can wherever you can, raid every Bunnings in the Midwest and get it to town, and then find what you can do with light tankers, fire appliances, water reticulation pumps, whatever you can to be able to spray it. And in the meantime, we're talking to DFES and WorkSafe to make sure that safe procedures were going to be followed for doing that. Also, air monitoring. So even though we'd advised, the air monitoring wasn't really necessary because of what John has explained about the behaviour of asbestos. When it gets broken, it's not so much in a friable form, but the community was demanding air monitoring. So just some photos of what it looked like. These are photos I've taken myself, except the aerial ones on scene. That's where I was staying.
That was after he started staying.
That was pretty funny when you go to stay somewhere and there's a sign out the front that's all broken and lying on the ground and everything's dark. But this is just one of the, I think I'll talk very quickly if I can before the end about rapid damage assessment that DFES do. So they go through each property very quickly and try and identify main things. So they pick up like if there's chemicals, respiratory injuries like fiberglass, suspected asbestos, and if they've taken a sample. So we are getting a little bit of information from DFES of the rapid damage assessment. Some of the people have taken their own action between the Monday and the Saturday when I arrived up there, and they bagged it out the front. This is sort of typical, either the fence had broken down or people had dragged things out and put it on the verge. So yes, that's myself and the other officer. We had to jump on a DFES plane on the Saturday and take a bunch of air monitoring kit. The only air monitoring equipment we've got is just 4 little pumps. And it was designed, I think, as John alluded to earlier, if there's a fire at one of these factories and there's nothing else we can do during the night, we can put the pumps out just to give reassurance that there wasn't high levels of fibres in the air at night, and maybe reduce the community concern and the need to evacuate people and swab all their houses, etc. So we only had 4 bits of kit. That's what the command centre looked like. There's all these dongers, the transportable buildings set up, I think primarily by Department of Biodiversity Conservation and all the rest of it. That's inside, sort of planning what we're going to do. It was mayhem. We were doing 6 a.m. starts, going to about 11 o'clock at night, just absolutely flat out without the time to even talk. So it was very, very difficult, very, very high intensity to get what we needed to do done. What we found out that on the Saturday, no one had had a really good look at the roads. So Marco and myself got out and started looking at the roads up. We put the asbestos monitors out and we found this in a number of areas. And ground into the ground, as John was mentioning about vehicles driving over it, actually crushed it and made it friable. So we had a high level of risk than initially intended, just assessed by pieces of broken ACM sheet. Then we had to try and work out which ones are asbestos, which ones are not, so we could prioritise cleanups and delineating areas. These are the initial maps, and this was done. It was getting dark when we were trying to go around and do all this. Areas which were clean, new houses. This area down here and up here are the primary contamination areas, and up north of northern part of town, there's little bits on the road here and there. Closing down roads. And said water trucks, so they were going all day into the evening. They'd shut down at night when we believed that there'd be less people moving around and vehicles, etc., because we just ran out of time with the trucks. Protecting the drains. These are the little pumps we use, the air check pumps, the little cartridge. That's at night, putting them out or taking them down and doing a calibration on them to make sure they're still reading correctly. So putting them on power poles in areas of where the most asbestos was. That's what they look like in the field. Just decontamination. So we use these latex boots, and we walked into an area where we've put a monitor up, and we'll remove the boots just do a dry decontamination. Security of the samples. We did some air monitoring with a dust track, so you're probably aware of these sort of gadgets, but that was just to give some reassurance to the community. The dust levels were very low. They were like below 20 micrograms per cubic metre when the Neckham standard is like 50. So what we were able to say, if there wasn't much dust in the air, then there's unlikely to be any fibres in the air, really low fibres. As John mentioned, all the results we got were below 0.01 in the end of, we sampled for weeks and we handed over to a contractor within 2 days. Trying to clean up bits of road, just doing a simple process of blocking the road with a couple of fire appliances and then a bit of water and then a little scrubbing brush and a dustpan and broom and a plastic bag. Public meetings, you all know about things like that. As John mentioned, we had a problem with all these different contractors doing different things and we'd clean a road and then we'd find it's contaminated the next day because the contractors are going to clean up the house and drag all the rubbish and asbestos contaminated material out onto the road and throw it on a ute and then take it down the tip and there's bits falling off. So we got them all together and explained what they should and shouldn't do. So that reduced that recontamination. One road was cleaned 4 times, got recontaminated 4 times. Problems, there was no immediate asbestos or ACM assessment of roads. I think there was only a part-time EHO up there and she was spread between a number of towns. So no one had a look at the roads until the Saturday. And that's almost a week afterwards. Myself and Mark went around and did it. The media escalation was an issue. About ability to respond to that was problematic. We didn't have enough resources. We'd run ragged. The glue and paint mix, so we got a mixture of how we do it, how much glue, how much PVA, Bondcrete. They couldn't get blue paint. They tried yellow. It wasn't work. You could see straight through it. One contractor had problems mixing the glue in the 1,000-litre container, so the glue sank to the bottom and he just burnt out 3 pumps. So we were losing resources by the day. There wasn't, as a state, we don't have, or government, we don't have this rapid response air monitoring. It's got to be contracted out. So we only did a stopgap for 2 days. I mentioned accommodation as an issue. Wearing PPE in the heat, it was hot up there and we're struggling with that, the amount of water you have to have and rotating people. We couldn't actually find anyone to do the cleanup. So no contractors in town that could do it. DFIRS didn't do it because it's too dangerous. The Army didn't want to do it, so it's too dangerous. And sort of, I think they shoot each other with guns. They shoot SES wouldn't do it, so we ended up grabbing one contractor that we got up there from a company called Faruna who come up to do air monitoring. We dressed him up in Tyvek and got to start scrubbing the road with one of our staff. Issues with landfill capabilities and capacity, so that I've tried to get our department to create a fast track approval process for emergency extensions to landfill acceptance criteria, etc. That's in the process. What we didn't have, so I was speaking to Mike Lindsay over the weekend, that we didn't seem to have availability of an EHO emergency pool of officers to get up there. So I think the call went out and a number of people put their hands up, but it wasn't a coordinated thing that we had some years ago. The result, so what I heard at the end of the weekend is that the air monitoring we've done and the work we've done with risk assessment and talking to John on the phone and Mike Lindsay, etc., and WorkSafe, is DFIRS said that stopped the town being evacuated. There was actually a word going around that they were looking at evacuating the whole town of Kalbarri. So we managed to fix that with some good advice from health department, some on the ground activity and showing the community and giving information out quickly. We had to do a lot of pragmatic solutions, won't go into them there, but imagine you can't just go by the book on a lot of these things. You've got to make up solutions in the field. We talked about the card rate for EHOs and a lot of the lessons, as John said, we're putting into our procedures. So we've just updated our procedures on asbestos emergency response and working with John. Is that, just to show you the media stuff, can I get, if anyone can't hear this, can we put a hand up, please? Right, so is that, people can't hear that? Get another hand up if you can't hear it.
You've got thumbs up.
Oh, so you can. All right, so we can hear it okay? Oh, so Talia can't hear, everyone else can hear? Right. We can hear it. All right, I'm hitting play. There we go. So I think, right, back to you, John, I think.
Okay, before I go on, I'll make a few comparisons, I suppose, from asbestos contamination as a result from cyclones such as Seroja and Yarloop, or asbestos fires or major bushfires. With the fire-damaged asbestos, it tends to be more brittle and friable than associated with cyclones, though we did encounter some really pulverised material on occasion, particularly if there was traffic movement associated with the Seroja cyclone. With fires, the contamination will tend to be more localised. And in case of Yarloop, it was just immediately around the buildings pretty well. The fire material was just blown away a long way away. With a cyclone, you might get, in fact, sheets or large pieces carried some distance and then smashing against other structures. So it can be a bit more widespread, though most of it would tend to be bonded material and still reasonably intact, but not always. With the fire, there's a greater need for stabilisation of the material because, as I say, it's brittle and friable, though it's also useful for protective purposes, for identification purposes, to also treat the asbestos contamination result of cyclones. And we believe the risks tend to be higher associated with asbestos fire contamination, and all the more need for some air monitoring, even though it's still primarily for reassurance purposes. In the case of wind damaged asbestos contamination, it's more likely that for asbestos removalists with a restricted licence can be used rather than an unrestricted licence, and I think quite extensively in Kalbarri, particularly for residential settings, people with restricted licence were being used. But for the more challenging areas, particularly if asbestos was heavily broken, associated with the high school and some public areas, the roads, then people with unrestricted licences would be necessary. So there's some distinctions between the two. But I should say the work done up in Kalbarri was phenomenally good. So looking into the future, based on what we've learnt recently and over the intervening 7 years or so, we need to revise our guidance package, I think. It's still good, but it could be much better, and incorporate more practical tools and procedures with inputs from local government and others as to what they might need. And our guidance is also followed by the cleanup consultants also. So we, as we have in the past, get input from them. As part of the work we're doing, within the directorate, we're looking at broadening what the work we've done on disaster response and recovery, and I suppose looking at that cadre of of EHOs that might be available, and also earmarking some people from here who can deploy more easily. Now, I went up to Kalbarri, but the level of preparation left a lot to be desired. I tried to capture my experience, did a report, lessons and so forth, but I think we're trying to improve our preparedness down here to better support, provide support in those sorts of situations. We are also looking at providing guidance for other natural disasters when asbestos may be disturbed. The guidelines, the guidance note on fires has elements in it that are quite suitable for these other type of disasters. And in fact, there's an appendix that mentions those different types of disasters and the steps that might be taken in dealing with them, but they are often quite different to an asbestos fire. So we probably need to develop that. Even though cyclones don't happen that often, major storms can, and floods as well. And we have to continue our effort to integrate better with emergency response and other agencies, particularly in regard to coordination and transition. We are revising the health asbestos regulations, and we understand the Parliamentary Council will come back to us shortly with their revision of our drafting instructions. And in it, we are trying to better cope cater for these type of situations, particularly if asbestos contamination has migrated from one area to another and the responsibility is uncertain. And also, we'd like to know more of what you see a need for in this sort of area. Next slide. So these are the sort of resources we have. The guidance note, as I said, the 2014 on fire damage asbestos, a brochure that goes with it, primarily for simple distillation of that information and to be provided to members of the public for their reassurance. A broader guideline that covers other types of hazards resulting from a bushfire, including the asbestos, but the CCA, treated timber, other contaminants or damage that are of environmental health significance. Also, to help anyone involved, we have a guidance note on the identification of asbestos materials in structures. Now, if the structure is destroyed, it may be less apparent, but still some of those features and the use of the particular area that material was used can be can help identify it as asbestos or not with that guidance. There's a code of practice for safe removal of asbestos, which is a WorkSafe document. And one would hope that any removal, well, certainly it should follow that process, that guidance. A list of unrestricted asbestos license holders, there's a link to that here, and also our contact details. And as I say, we are very happy to provide advice and deploy if need be. Okay, I'll let you do it.
Questions?
Yes. Stop presenting. Is that someone?
Step on your face and our faces. All right, well, thank you both Ken and John for your presentations. That was very interesting. And we've had a few really good questions that have come in through the audience. Here we've got the City of Vincent has asked a couple of really good questions. So firstly, while the fire is still active, should environmental health officers attend, or is it best to wait until the second contact once the emergency is under control? So generally, the emergency services will call local government in respect to the EHO or the building services.
Yep.
Yeah.
So my response to that is you should be there whilst the fire's going, because you are the specialists to advise the lead agency. I think one of the comments I saw come up is about the AIM system, or the Australasian Interagency Incident Management System, which most agencies work under. So you have a lead agency, which is DFS, and they are looking for advice from various people, including local government. They need to know about how to manage the asbestos. They'll have an idea, but having someone like yourselves there to say, look, you need to shut this area down, they'll go, thank you, right, and they'll make it happen. They'll get onto the planning officer or logistics officer and make it happen. The other thing that they need is the drainage diagrams, because if John was mentioning it, you're putting a lot of water on, it's going down drains. Where's it gone? You find that that's gone into a local park or something as a drainage swath or something. So my advice would be EHO should be there during the fire. Your role will really kick off in the recovery, but over the years, recovery used to be something that happened way after, like the fire brigade would leave and then 2 days later someone would think about it. Over time, we've been pushing that the recovery should actually start as soon as the emergency services get there. They're thinking about what's going to happen once they leave and make sure that there's a plan. So in a big incident, they'll do a thing called an impact statement, which some of you may have seen. They won't do it for small fires, but they actually will work with the recovery agency, which is normally local government, say, right, are you okay to take over? You've got everything planned. So I'd say get there whilst the fire's burning, and then you can get a real assessment of what's happening, what the recovery process will be, and also you can provide that advice to the emergency services to maybe minimise the impact as well.
Can I do a follow-on question in that regard? When we first developed the guidance note some while ago, it was uncertain as to whether local government were automatically notified by DFS if there was a fire, and we were looking at coming to an arrangement with DFS to ensure that in the intervening time, has it in fact eventuated that DFS would normally let local government know of a fire happening at that time or subsequently?
You can't rely on it. It depends on the people on duty at DFS at the time. There's some controller of saying, I want someone from local government, etc. Where are we?
Saying it doesn't happen all the time in the city of Vincent.
Yeah, absolutely. So often if we get called out, one of the first things we say, have you contacted local government? And we ask them to do that, and we can get the HOs out there. So, I mean, there'll be hopefully some people online who'll go, oh yeah, I remember you got me out of bed at 3 a.m. because we actually said, yeah, you need the EHO out here. And yeah, we've had some EHOs come out at 3 a.m. who really engage and start looking at that recovery process.
Maybe in our review of the guidance note, we need to talk to local governments and also DFS and see if they want to be notified of that sort of thing as soon as possible.
Okay, another good question. In terms of air monitoring, does air monitoring always happen as part of the pollution response?
No. So, we generally are called out for chemical fires. So we're doing chemical detection and particulates. With asbestos, because we're not really the experts on it, we're a stopgap. So we're waiting for EHOs to come out or Department of Health to take over. So all we've got really is those 4 detected samplers, which we can deploy very quickly, but that's just a stopgap until really the health experts arrive. Having said that, look, the team I've got, some of them are EHOs or ex-EHOs. We've only got 5. We run out of people in no time. I think Friday we had 3 incidents running on Friday afternoon, and so we're just not able to do the whole asbestos monitoring well.
And normally it's not necessary. I think other combustibles in the building are normally a greater immediate concern than any asbestos. As I say, most of the very fine material that could pose a risk is carried away and diluted massively. It's the fine material that might settle and subsequently be disturbed and turn into fibre that would be of greater concern, but maybe a bit further down the track. And really, we're still looking at low levels, very low exposure times, and therefore very low risk.
If I can just say that there's been research done on this. So some years ago, and if anyone wants the paper, just let me know. I'll try and find it. But the Chem Centre and the Victorian Metropolitan Fire Authority did some testing. They actually burnt pellets of wood and put asbestos on it inside a building with asbestos samples all around it. And I think they found one fibre.
Yeah.
From all the
and that's some of the research material we used when we developed the guidelines in 2014. And the Victorians were very good in sending that and additional data across to us. I think because they had a series of fires in the lead up, and so they did that additional work. So much of that is incorporated in our guidance note. Well, made use of, if not necessarily referenced.
Yeah, so I think if you prioritise something, I'd prioritise getting stabilised with the glue and paint rather than doing, we'll do some monitoring first and then look at that afterwards.
This one was for John. So in your opinion, are our legislative tools sufficient or appropriate to issue a direction for air monitoring to occur whilst cleaning and remediation happen?
I think they are. Certainly in the revision of the health asbestos regulations, we've broadened what actions that a local government or an authorised officer can have, because previously they used a number of terms like repair or remove. We've broadened it to cover a whole greater range of actions that a local government might be able to require to be done. And I would hope that they would still do it, and they may well have the power, but even if they didn't have the power, I would hope that it would be done. But I would think they currently do, but we're trying to broaden the scope of their powers to cover everything that would be useful for this sort of
and I think if Val or anyone from WorkSafe online might want to make a comment, but my understanding of the requirement, if you've got a unrestricted asbestos contractor that's doing a cleanup, they have to do air monitoring on the site. And that might be sufficient for you to use as a surrogate to say if there's nothing on the site, then there shouldn't be impacts on site. But we could see how you have with the off-site sampling.
We also have just a couple of statements in terms of the DFAS response in regional areas. It tends to mostly be focused in the metro area. Rather than the regions, the local government tends to be the lead.
Okay, so I think the question relates to when you don't have a career fire brigade, it's usually run by local government, and it's split between, if I understand this correctly, you have a bush fire brigade, and then you have a volunteer fire and rescue. So the volunteer fire and rescue are trained up to hazmat or hazardous material capabilities. So generally what we'd advise is if you come across a fire as your local government bushfire brigade and you find there's asbestos in it, that you call it as a hazmat fire, and then therefore it should transition to management by DFAS, hopefully, if everything works the way it should. Because and this happens for a bunch of other things like petrol tanker rollovers in remote areas and chemical truck fires and things that the bushfire brigade get out there, they are not equipped to deal with that, and so they need to stand back and go get the volunteer fire and rescue or their career fire service. So I think we had one last week, might be Wednesday, where we had something in a remote country town, and so I contacted DFAS and said, look, this is a hazmat job. So they actually deployed fire brigade, I think, maybe 200 k's away or something. It was a long way they had to go to this particular job. Well, Val's just said that that's correct about the requirement to on-site monitoring. I think Val on WorkSafe.
And I don't know if other people can see it, but Karina Ottner's made the comment that a fine mist of water in the interim early on, if need be, is sufficient to keep the fibre down or minimise disturbance until PVA or other bonding material can be introduced.
I thought that might be a question that we might answer is when we're thinking about what might come up. You've got to be pragmatic. So I remember one fire, I think it was in Augusta or Margaret River, just a single house fire with asbestos, and it happened on a Friday. And they said, what are we going to do? There's going to be no one in town that can do the glue thing or start demolition. And so we said, well, can we get the volunteer fireys to come past, twice a day perhaps, and just see if it's still wet and put a mist of water over the top of it just to keep it wet all the time. Other situations where that's not possible, we said, well, can we get sprinklers, a lot of reticulation and sprinklers put on that are on the timer that come on for 10 minutes every hour or something. So these aren't things that are in the instruction manual or anything. It's like, what can you do as your best endeavours as an EHA to minimise risk to public health? And you might have to be a bit creative whilst also managing public health and your health and safety issues.
It will partly depend on the situation. If the neighbours are at some distance, there's fences in between, it's not windy, there's vegetation there, then the need, it will depend on the circumstances. And as I say, it's normally very, very hard to get a measurement of asbestos in air above the limit of detection. So we have that background. It's probably better to do more than less and be reassuring to the public. but really we're dealing with pretty low levels of risk.
I think just going back to one of my early comments about the perception of risk, though, and this is where I kind of got started in this with fires. For those of you who remember Alison Edmonds, who was at Augusta Margaret River, she had multiple houses with asbestos in them, and they'd actually treated one with glue, but because it wasn't visible, PVA glue is clear when it dries. So somebody contacted the Premier, so there's a house down the road, and so they've got asbestos all over. And so having a visual determinant that something's been done, and that's why I said to her, look, use blue paint. The blue paint, it's not, white blue. Blue just went, it's not an emergency bright red warning, it's just like something's been done, and you can see the pattern when it's been done. So that's kind of where that came from.
So it's lucky you went for blue.
Oh,
but in Soroja they use a bit of yellow as well.
Yes.
We'll use whatever you can get, but try to be consistent.
Yep.
Don't keep on mixing your colours, it's confusing.
And just another question, in Northampton, where was the contaminated water and debris disposed of?
So the water I'm not sure of. The debris, so there was a number of landfills, I might get this wrong, but there was a Kalbarri landfill, I think there was one in Northampton, but the debris from the houses, the demolitions of such volumes, I think it was going down to Maru landfill in Geraldton.
I think it was initially, and then they realised later in the piece that Kalbarri had capacity for that, and maybe any material that emerged later, asbestos debris, etc., may have been sent to Kalbarri because they did open it up to be able to take large quantities, primarily from Kalbarri, but elsewhere as necessary. But initially, I think it went down to Geraldton.
And that's one of the lessons learned, is that, as I said, we didn't have enough resources to really look at all of the issues there. We only had a couple of people there on rotation. But we needed to be looking at the landfill and helping out the local government. So I think Valerie went up to one of the landfills and raised a number of safety and potential environmental concerns that we'd missed. So in our review, and I'm meeting with DFIS at 1 o'clock this afternoon to the the recovery controller, just to run through some of the lessons learned this afternoon. That was one of them, that we really need to focus on the landfills. And from a remote EHO point of view as well, you've got to be thinking about that, but how are you going to manage everything from a whale carcass to asbestos damage properties, whatever, at your landfills, short notice.
Okay, so is there any more questions from the group?
And we would welcome feedback either now or later as to what we or maybe can do in this regard.
Definitely, this is a we. And you've got the big capital letter, not the small.
So I'm going on camera indicating that we're willing to do more, and we'd certainly like to be guided by the needs out there, and we will certainly consult before we formalise anything further.
Yeah, but I was going to say, look, there are things happening at a higher level over this. After the Yarloop fire, I'm on the State Recovery Committee, and we got a contractor on board through some funding through DFIS anyway, to look at all the lessons learned about emergency recovery and waste management for Yarloop. It was a 200-page report, 53 recommendations that went up in 2018. It was just too big. Then no one could digest it, so we got a contractor, which is Heather Squire. Some of you might know her from Walga. So she came on board with us last year and worked like a human hurricane for 9 months, and developed a report to the State Recovery Committee that has recommendations to address most of the issues we talked about, and including the rapid damage assessment of having EHOs and building surveyors embedded into that. So you don't only you don't suspect asbestos, you can say it is asbestos. It has a unfenced swimming pool. There are chemicals there, swimming pool chemicals or pesticides. And we put forward a near map, not near map, what I'm talking about, by auditor or a Arcgis Survey123 electronic way of doing that. So it captures the location and photographs, the findings and drop down lists, things like that. So that's just one recommendation of a whole pile, but we're trying to deal with it strategically, and also a training package for EHOs and people who have to respond as well. So we're trying to fix the big stuff whilst also what's called building the ship as we're sailing it. Questions last week?
Yeah, so there's a question that's come through from Rockingham. What about QNS emailed through the questions?
Email through last week.
I don't think I believe I received it.
Not guilty.
I don't think I received any questions that came through, but
If we can't access them now,
I'll have a look and then I'll raise them with both of you and we can send it out with some of the materials as well. So just quickly, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us here today and mention that our next webinar will be on Tuesday, the 16th of November. We're going to be talking about environmental health workforce capacity in local government, as well as the functions of the WA Environmental Health Professional Review Board. As I mentioned, today's session will be recorded and sent out to everyone that has registered and also be put on our Environmental Health YouTube page. We will also be sending out a very quick 2-3 minute evaluation form. So we would love your feedback in terms of technology and the content and ideas for future webinars too. So thank you, and thank you, Ken and John, again.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks everyone for taking time out. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.